At 23:19 hours, the Strait of Hormuz went quiet in the one-way sailors fear most. The kind of quiet that means someone is holding their breath before they pull a trigger. The water was ink black under a low ceiling of broken cloud, the moon smothered, the stars erased. A northwest wind at 17 knots pushed a ragged chop across the shipping lanes, slapping hull plating and turning the surface into restless, shifting shards of reflected light. Visibility hovered around 4.2 nautical miles, and the air tasted of salt, diesel, and distant dust blown off the Iranian coast. It was late night, the hour when fatigue makes every contact feel like a question mark, and every question mark can get men killed. 3 American warships entered anyway. I'm your host at US Defense Watch, where we break down the operations shaping global security. And what happened when 3 US destroyers pushed into a strait Iran claimed it had closed was not just another standoff. It was a wake-up call for any fleet that thinks a chokepoint can be controlled with threats alone. Iran had announced the closure hours earlier with the kind of language designed to sound absolute. They called it a defensive measure, a security operation, a response to provocation. But what it really was a test. Could Tehran turn geography into a weapon and force the US Navy to blink? The Strait of Hormuz does not forgive miscalculation. At its narrowest, the usable shipping channel compresses into lanes and separators that concentrate the world's most valuable traffic into predictable patterns. In daylight, it is crowded and tense. At night, it becomes something else. A confined arena filled with fast-moving shadows, layered electronic noise, and enough civilian clutter to make every hostile act hide behind a dozen innocent ones. Iran's aggressor force that night was built to exploit exactly that environment. The core was a coordinated mix of patrol boats and coastal missile coverage centered near the Iranian littoral, reinforced by a single Mawj-class light frigate positioned as a command node. The frigate ran dark with disciplined emissions control, holding just outside the densest merchant AIS cluster so that her weight could blend into the chaos. Her engines kept her at 28 knots, a steady posture speed that allowed rapid repositioning without screaming intent. On her deck, canisters for Qatar anti-ship cruise missiles sat ready, sea-skimming weapons with a 300-kilometer reach designed to punish ships that believed distance was protection. Closer to shore, fast attack craft waited inside coves and behind headlands, their coxswains practicing the geometry of swarm harassment runs. Accelerate, threaten, force a defensive maneuver, and then retreat back under the umbrella of coastal coverage before a larger ship can close. The 3 US ships entering the strait were Arleigh Burke-class destroyers, moving as a tight, disciplined surface action group. They did not come in like a parade. Their navigation lights were reduced. Their formations were built for mutual support and overlapping fields of fire. Their radars alternated between passive and active tasking to limit exposure while preserving track quality. Above them, the air was not empty. An MH-60R Seahawk orbited beyond visual range, using multi-mode radar and infrared to scan the seam between civilian traffic and hostile littoral movement. Farther back, beyond the mouth of the strait, the carrier USS Abraham Lincoln held station with the broader strike group, not because a carrier needed to be in the choke point, but because carriers project the kind of pressure that changes enemy decisions before shots are fired. Iran wanted the opposite. They wanted the fight close. They wanted it messy. They wanted to force an incident inside the narrow lane where any American response could be framed as escalation against defensive patrols. So they built their closure around ambiguity, warnings broadcast over maritime channels, small craft in the lanes, and the threat of missiles that could appear without warning. At 2322 hours, the first Iranian broadcast hit open maritime guard, accented and formal, repeating like a recorded loop. Foreign warships are prohibited from transiting. You are entering a restricted zone. Turn away immediately. The American destroyers did not answer at first. They kept moving at 20 knots, their bows shouldering through chop, their wakes flattened into dark ribbons. In the combat information centers, watch teams listened, tracked, and waited for the moment when the threat stopped being rhetoric and started becoming physics. At 2324 hours and 18 seconds, the first real threat signature appeared. Not a missile, not a radar lock. A a cluster of fast contacts accelerating from the Iranian shoreline. Surface contacts, multiple, bearing 032, range 18 nautical miles, speed 35 knots and increasing. The voice on the circuit was calm. It always is, right before it isn't. The Iranian boats were moving like they had rehearsed it. 4 contacts at first, then 6 as additional hulls joined from behind a headland. Their speeds jumped in bursts, 36 knots, then 41, then 44 as they slammed into the chop and threw spray high enough to confuse optical tracking and pulses. Their intended geometry was obvious. They were not trying to sink a destroyer with gunfire. They were trying to force the Americans to maneuver, to break formation, to slow, to hesitate, to create a moment that could be filmed and later sold as U.S. warships repelled. The U.S. destroyers held line. At 2325 hours, the lead destroyer sent the first warning. Iranian patrol craft, this is United States Navy warship. You are approaching a lawful transit corridor. Maintain safe distance. Alter course now. The boats did not alter. At 2325 hours and 37 seconds, a second warning followed, colder and more specific. Iranian craft, you are on an unsafe approach vector. Reduce speed to 5 knots and turn away. Failure to comply will be considered hostile intent. Still nothing. The Iranian commander on the frigate watched the approach on his own displays and felt the confidence that comes from having multiple threat layers. The boats were bait. The missiles were the blade. He did not need a kill. He needed a narrative. He needed a moment where the U.S. Navy looked uncertain. Then the Strait's darkness betrayed him. What they didn't know was that the U.S. Navy had already been tracking the aggressor for 96 hours using surveillance assets. It started long before this night's broadcast threats. Satellite imagery had flagged irregular activity at Iranian coastal facilities. Small craft refueled in concentrated windows, missile canister handling around the Mauj-class frigate, patterns inconsistent with routine patrol cycles. A P-8 Poseidon had built the surface pattern of life from outside the dense envelope, mapping departure times and correlating hull signatures through radar and electro-optical confirmation. Undersea surveillance cueing and acoustic analysis had separated fast attack craft transits from civilian noise by their propulsion harmonics, giving U.S. planners a quiet truth. The closure was not a spontaneous reaction. It was a planned operation with assigned lanes, rehearsed timings, and a command node positioned to escalate if the Americans complied. So the 3 destroyers were not walking into surprise. They were walking into a script they had already read. At 2326 hours and 12 seconds, the lead destroyer's combat system promoted the closest Iranian boat cluster to a higher threat category based on speed, heading, and refusal to comply. The SPY-1D radar refined tracks. Electro-optical sensors provided visual confirmation. The MH-60R above pushed a crisp infrared feed. Boats slamming over wave crests, bow guns stabilized forward, men visible behind shields, engines screaming. At 2326 hours and 44 seconds, the American Surface Action Group commander issued a single instruction across the net. Hold course. Box them. Do not give them the picture they want. The box formed in minutes. The left-hand destroyer drifted 3 degrees outward to widen lateral separation and create a clean engagement lane. The right-hand destroyer tightened inward to close an escape seam between merchant traffic and the Iranian approach corridor. The center destroyer maintained steady speed, acting as the anchor and primary communicator. At 2327 hours and 09 seconds, the American ships launched the next layer. An MH-60R Seahawk dropped lower, moved forward, and began overt illumination and identification. Its radar swept, its FLIR locked. Overhead, it was not just watching, it was declaring presence. Iran's boats pressed anyway. At 2327 hours and 41 seconds, range fell to 11.6 nautical miles. Speeds held at 43 to 45 knots for the lead craft. The chop punished them. Spray hammered their decks. But the coxswains were committed now. They had been told the Americans would hesitate. They had been told this was their moment. At 2328 hours and 02 seconds, The first Iranian boat broke slightly off the center line, angling toward the gap between the lead destroyer and a merchant tanker running southbound. It was a classic move. Use civilian traffic as cover. Force the warship to choose between collision risk and tactical clarity. Two more boats mirrored the maneuver from the opposite side, creating a funnel. The American answer was immediate and clinical. At 2328 hours and 11 seconds, the center destroyer broadcast a final warning. Iranian craft, stop now. You are entering weapons engagement criteria. Turn away. At 2328 hours and 23 seconds, with no compliance, the destroyer fired a controlled warning burst. Not at a boat, but into the water ahead of the lead craft. The rounds walked across the surface, carving bright splashes into the darkness and drawing a literal line in the sea. The Iranian lead boat did not turn. Instead, it accelerated again, trying to punch through before the Americans could raise the response bar. At 2328 hours and 37 seconds, the US escalated one rung. A precision-disabling burst struck the lead boat's engine housing. The effect was visible even through night vision. The wake collapsed, the stern dug, the hull yawed hard to port. Speed fell from 44 knots to 19 in 5 seconds. The boat did not explode. It did not need to. It became a piece of floating uncertainty. Dangerous because it still carried weapons, but no longer able to control a range. The second and third Iranian boats reacted differently. One peeled away immediately, turning back toward the coast at 40 knots, spray throwing high as it ran. The other hesitated, just long enough to be caught in a second engagement lane and forced into a stop with another controlled burst that cratered water around its bow and made the coxswain understand that the next burst would not be a warning. By 2329 hours and 08 seconds, the swarm had broken. The narrative Iran wanted was already failing, so Tehran moved to the blade. At 2329 hours and 41 seconds, the Muj-class frigate shifted emissions. Her radar pulse pattern tightened. On American displays, it registered as a change from search behavior to something more specific, more deliberate. Weapons lock indications began to light across the destroyer's electronic warfare consoles. The frigate was not firing yet, but it was shaping. It was threatening. It was trying to restore control by forcing the Americans to react to missile danger instead of small boats. The US response did not panic. It layered. At 2329 hours and 58 seconds, the lead destroyer activated its electronic countermeasures posture. Decoy launchers were armed. Defensive missiles were readied. Phalanx CIWS systems spun up, their radar-guided mounts slewing and stabilizing as if waking from sleep. RIM-116 rolling airframe missile launchers indexed toward the threat sector. The destroyer did not need to fire to make a point. The point was that the moment a missile left the rail, it would be met by overlapping steel and algorithms. At 2330 hours and 12 seconds, the American commander issued the order that ended ambiguity. Designate hostile. Prepare to neutralize missile-capable platform if it commits. At 2330 hours and 21 seconds, the MH-60R above the formation pivoted onto the frigate's bearing and began a fast run toward its position, staying low enough to reduce exposure while maintaining sensor quality. The Iranian frigate's captain had expected the US to slow, maybe to hold station outside the strait's mouth, to negotiate the closure with distance and diplomacy. Instead, 3 destroyers had entered at night and refused to be turned. Now his fast boats were disabled or retreating, and an American helicopter was closing on his missile platform. He needed to regain initiative. At 2331 hours and 03 seconds, he ordered missile preparation. On the frigate's deck, crews moved toward canisters. On American sensors, small shifts in heat signature and topside activity registered. The P-8 pattern of life work over the last 4 days had taught the US exactly what missile prep looked like on this hull. The Americans recognized it in seconds. At 2331 hours and 19 seconds, the call came across the US net. Hostile platform preparing launch, weapons free on commit. The frigate's captain crossed the line anyway. At 2331 hours and 41 seconds, a Keter anti-ship cruise missile launched from the Iranian frigate and drove out over the water at sea-skimming altitude. its engine plume briefly visible as a bright point in the humid night. The missile's intended target was not the carrier. It was one of the destroyers, a symbolic kill inside the Strait, proof that the closure was real. The US escort screen answered with the kind of layered violence that makes sea-skimming missiles a gamble, not a guarantee. At 2,331 hours and 52 seconds, the destroyer's SPY-1D radar held the missile track. Fire control assigned intercept geometry. At 2,332 hours and 4 seconds, the first defensive shot left an American launcher. The engagement did not rely on one weapon. It relied on sequence. If the first layer missed, the next was ready. At 2,332 hours and 16 seconds, the missile crossed 8.4 nautical miles from the launch point and descended lower. Its profile sharpened. It began its terminal approach. At 2,332 hours and 23 seconds, the second layer engaged. RIM-116 RAM launched in a snapping, immediate arc, accelerating hard and climbing just enough to intersect the sea skimmer's path. The missile seeker logic did what it was built to do: find the threat faster than the threat could find the ship. At 2,332 hours and 28 seconds, the intercept happened 2.9 nautical miles from the destroyer. A flash in the dark, a hard shock of sound, fragments splashing into the chop. The Kater did not reach gun range. It did not reach decoy range. It died in the mid-layer. For Iran, the failure was devastating. The closure narrative had depended on one clean strike. Instead, the missile had been erased before it could force the Americans to maneuver. For the US, the intercept was only step one. The threat source still existed. And it had now committed a clear hostile act inside a congested international waterway against a US warship transiting at night. That changed everything. At 2,332 hours and 41 seconds, the American commander executed the next phase: neutralize the shooter. The MH-60R already moving toward the frigate became the forward spear. It did not approach like a movie hero. It approached like a technician with a checklist. From standoff range, it confirmed the frigate's course, speed, and current weapons posture. The Iranian ship tried to maneuver, increasing to 30 knots and turning toward coastal clutter, hoping to blend into the shoreline and create a political shield. The Americans removed that option. Iran's attempt to close the Strait of Hormuz had depended on three assumptions: that threats would create compliance, that clutter would protect aggression, and that the US Navy would choose caution over confrontation in narrow waters at night. All three assumptions died in less than 18 minutes. At 2,338 hours and 12 seconds, the US Surface Action Group resumed steady transit, maintaining 19 knots in formation discipline. The destroyers did not linger to pose. They did not need to. Their continued movement was the strongest statement possible. The Strait is not yours to close. Behind them, the carrier USS Abraham Lincoln remained over the horizon, present without being exposed, a reminder that US sea power does not have to crowd a choke point to dominate it. It simply has to hold the architecture: sensors, air, surface combatants, submarines, and the discipline to act faster than an adversary can change their mind. In the hours after, analysts would break down the incident as a missile engagement, a small boat swarm attempt, and a disablement action. But the deeper truth was simpler. Iran had tried to convert geography into a shield. The US Navy had turned geography into a trap for the aggressor instead. Because in modern naval warfare, the side that owns the timeline owns the sea. The lesson is ruthless. Closing a strait is not a press release. It is a capability that must survive surveillance, interdiction, and retaliation. If your missile launchers can be tracked for days, your small craft can be boxed in minutes, and your sea skimmers can be erased in seconds, then your closure is not control. It is theater. And that night at 2,319 hours, 3 US destroyers entered at night and proved that the difference between a threat and a blockade is not intent. It is dominance. It is the ability to move through contested water and darkness with your formation intact, your weapons disciplined, your rescue capacity ready, and your adversary forced to choose between escalation and humiliation. Iran chose humiliation. The strait stayed open. And every Navy watching learned the same hard truth. In 2026, the sea belongs to the side that can see first, decide first, and strike with layered certainty, even when the night tries to hide the difference between a warning and a war. At 2333 hours and 12 seconds, one of the Arleigh Burke-class destroyers launched an anti-surface engagement from beyond the frigate's effective gun range, designed to disable rather than obliterate. The goal was control, break propulsion, break sensors, and stop further missile launches. At 2333 hours and 27 seconds, the first impact struck the frigate's forward sensor suite. Radar faces went dark. Secondary antennas shattered. The bridge lighting flickered. The ship did not sink. It did not need to. It lost its eyes. At 2333 hours and 49 seconds, the second impact hit amidships near the missile canister area, detonating external equipment and throwing smoke across the deck. The missile team scattered. Any attempt at a second launch died under fire and flame. At 2334 hours and 11 seconds, the frigate's speed fell from 30 knots to 17. At 2334 hours and 22 seconds to 11. At 2334 hours and 39 seconds to 6, she began to drift, bow swinging into the wind. The U.S. Navy did not relax. Not in this strait. Not after one missile launch. Not with fast craft still in the area. At 2334 hours and 58 seconds, the destroyers tightened the ring and maintained standoff. Phalanx CYWS stayed spun and ready. RAM launchers remained indexed. Decoy systems remained armed. The Seahawk orbited overhead, scanning for any secondary threats. The broader strike group, including the carrier over the horizon, maintained an air defense lid and a sensor umbrella that made additional Iranian escalation increasingly unattractive. At 2335 hours, Iran tried to salvage what it could. Coastal radio circuits lit up. Additional small craft contacts stirred along the shoreline. A second cluster accelerated briefly, then slowed as soon as they entered the destroyer's engagement lanes and realized the night was no longer theirs. The closure had failed, and the failure was visible. But the story was not over, because the Strait is not only a battlefield, it is also a place where humans go into the water and time becomes a knife. At 2335 hours and 31 seconds, amid the chaos of the missile intercept and the frigate disablement, the earlier disabled Iranian boat, the one the Americans had crippled with a precision burst, began to take on water in the chop. Its crew fired flares and waved arms, not in attack, but in panic. The sea does not care who started the incident. It only cares who floats. The U.S. commander made a decision that turned the night from a fight into a statement. He ordered a rescue, not because Iran deserved it, because the U.S. Navy would not allow a maritime battlefield to become a slaughter when control had already been established. At 2336 hours, an MH-60R Seahawk shifted again, dropping low over the struggling craft. The crew began a controlled hover, rotor wash flattening the chop into a violent swirl. The Helo's rescue swimmer moved to the door. A line dropped. The first Iranian sailor grabbed it and was hauled up. And that was when the remaining Iranian elements understood they had lost more than a standoff. They had lost the moral narrative too. At 2336 hours and 44 seconds, a voice on an Iranian circuit transmitted a hurried order to withdraw all small craft and cease aggressive action. The message did not sound like confidence. It sounded like damage control in the political sense. Stop the bleeding. Stop the optics. Stop the escalation spiral before someone on shore made a decision they could not walk back. By 2337 hours, the U.S. destroyers held the transit lane with clear dominance. The Iranian frigate drifted crippled, smoke thinning, weapons silent. Small boats were retreating. Rescue operations were underway for those who had been caught in the sea. And the Strait itself, the supposed weapon of closure, was still open under American control. The outcome was not measured in ships sunk. It was measured in initiative seized.